Have you ever thought of tracing your family history? Anyone can do it. Let me show you how to get started.
Like humans do. I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out.
Probably the most important of the primary sources for family history research are birth, marriage and death certificates, parish registers and census returns. Although parish registers have been kept in some parishes for over 450 years, it wasn't until the start of civil registration in 1837 that birth, marriages and deaths were comprehensively recorded. Firstly, let us look at birth certificates, which most people are familiar with. Apart from the child's name, the most important thing shown on a birth certificate is the name of the child's parents, including the mother's maiden name. This information can allow you to trace the parents' marriage and move your research back a generation. The place of birth shown can, with earlier certificates, link in with census returns, which I'll talk about later. If you are not lucky enough to have original certificates for your family, modern copies can be easily obtained from the General Register Office via their website or by post. The information on a modern copy is just the same as for an original. To find the reference number you need, you can use one of the pay-per-view websites or a free website called FreeBMD, Births, Marriages and Deaths, which is easier to use but at the present time not complete. For researchers without internet access, the indexes you need to find the reference numbers can be found at county record offices and some large local libraries. The copy certificate we see here relates to Amy Florence Hart, who was born in 1910, and she can be seen here pictured with her parents, brother and sister. Marriage certificates, besides giving us the name, address and occupation of the happy couple, also give us their fathers' names and their occupations, and if they were still alive at the time of the marriage. This is another link to a previous generation. With marriage certificates, it's always worth having a close look at the witnesses. They can very often be unknown family members, people that you haven't found before. The ages given on marriage certificates should be treated with caution. There are many reasons why people might lie about their ages when they get married. Possibly one was underage, maybe one was a lot older than they say and didn't want people to know about it. So it's worth remembering that. Looking at our copy certificate, there was no problem with the ages there, as both Benjamin Howell and Emma Baker gave their correct ages. And the picture we see is them taken probably about the time of their marriage. Death certificates are where we say goodbye to our ancestors, and again it is as well to look carefully at the age given, as the person most likely to know the correct age is the one that has just died. And often the informant of the death might not be a family member and only guess at the age. In the case of our copy certificate, the informant was the son, and he got it right. Thomas Patrick was 69. As civil registration only began in 1837, for events before that date, the family historian needs to look at parish registers. We will of course find marriages there, and instead of births and deaths, it will be baptisms and burials. Let's look at some parish register examples and I'll explain the differences. Printed registers for baptisms and burials didn't start until 1812, so anything before that date was just written into a blank book. Care needs to be taken with early registers because they tended to mix the events on one page, as can be seen here, with the baptisms shown in red and the burials in blue, on this register from Normanton in Derby in 1798. A couple of years later, in nearby Chellaston, the baptisms and burials were still on the same page, but at least they were kept separate, making them a lot easier for the family historian to read. The dates of these changes varied from one parish to another and depended a lot on the local vicar. A few years earlier in Kettleborough, Suffolk, they were already recording baptisms on separate pages. And this nice clear page also shows the differences between private and public baptisms. If a child was born and not expected to survive, it was often privately baptised, and then if it did survive, might be publicly baptised later. So don't be surprised to find two baptisms for the same child. However, sometimes a child died and a later child was given the same name. So it is well to look for a possible burial in these cases. On this page, the vicar also recorded the mother's maiden name, which is often omitted from early registers. From 1812 onwards, baptisms and burials were in printed registers. The information given would now be the same for every parish, but unfortunately there was no column for the mother's maiden name. Even so, some vicars did put it in. The example shown is for the baptism of Thomas Patrick in 1859, which nicely dates this very early photograph of the infant Thomas sitting on his mother Clara's knee. Like baptisms, early burial registers can appear to be very difficult to read at first glance, but a closer look often reveals more than expected. With a little practice, skills at reading old handwriting can soon be acquired, and there are several inexpensive books to help if necessary. The printed registers for burials are similar in format to the baptism books, but with a little less information, and nothing like the detail found on a death certificate. But burial entries can lead you to find gravestones in the local churchyard, and monumental inscriptions can often tell you more than the register did, especially if there was more than one person buried in the grave. When we get to marriages, printed registers were in use much earlier than baptisms and burials, but the introduction of them seems to vary from one parish to another. Early marriage registers can sometimes be quite muddled and difficult to tell one entry from another, as we see from this 1780 marriage in Chellaston, Derbyshire. However, the advantage for family historians is that we now get to see our ancestors sign their names or make their mark, and give us a clue as to what education they might have had. In this case, Thomas Daniel signs his name, but his bride, Elizabeth Turner, makes her mark. Early printed marriage registers usually had 4 entries to a page, and this can be an advantage when looking to see if the witnesses were family members. If the same person witnesses more than one marriage, as we see here in Derby, it is likely that he is connected with the church rather than being a friend or family of the happy couple. After 1812, the registers had 2 marriages to a page and were much more like the format we see today on modern marriage certificates. Looking at our example from 1860, we see that all 4 people on the top entry made their marks, whereas on the lower entry, the bride and groom both signed their names, and as a bonus for the family historians, so did all 5 of the witnesses, rather than the usual 2. We now move on to census returns, which can tell us a lot about the family groups that our ancestors lived in. National population censuses have been taken every 10 years since 1801, but it was not until 1841 that names of the population were actually listed. I would like to tell the story of one man to illustrate how you can trace a person's life using the records we've already looked at and the census returns. That man is William Goodchild. From parish registers, we know that William was born in 1830 in Woolwich, Kent, now part of Greater London. By the time of the 1841 census, William was living in Greenwich and can be seen on this census page alongside his sister and 2 brothers. The 1841 census only gives us the minimum of information, and it should be noted that the ages shown need to be treated with caution, as the adult ages were usually rounded down to the nearest 5, although not all census enumerators followed this rule. The first census to give us a really useful amount of information came in 1851, and we now see William Goodchild living in Deptford with his mother and other family members. Family relationships are shown along with marital status and reasonably accurate ages, although they weren't always so. We are also told what our ancestor did for a living and where he was born. We can see that William was an apprentice boilermaker. This example also shows that some census returns can be quite difficult to read, as the originals have faded over time. From 1851 onwards, the format of the census pages remain much the same, as can be seen here in 1861. Although he is still in Deptford, William Goodchild was no longer living with his family, but was in lodgings, and he had finished his apprenticeship and was now working as a boilermaker. In 1868, William is in Derby and getting married to a lady named Jane Pegg. There are two things worth noting on this marriage certificate. Firstly, William's father John is shown as deceased, which ties in with his mother being shown as a widow on the 1851 census, and helps to narrow down the search for John's death. Secondly, William lied about his age and knocked 8 years off, probably to be nearer the age of his bride. The 1871 census shows us William and Jane living in Derby with their young son. Further research has shown that they had a son shortly after they were married, but he died, and the child shown on this census was in fact their second son. They also had a daughter 6 months after this census was taken. William is still working as a boilermaker, probably in the big Derby Railway Works. By 1881, William had left his family in Derby, living with his wife's parents, and he was in lodgings in Barrow-in-Furness, working as a ship's plater. Probably similar work to what he had been used to, but shows the need to adapt when necessary. Possibly following the workaround, William had moved again by the time of the 1891 census, and was still living in lodgings, but this time in Leeds. He was also back working as a boilermaker. Nottingham is where we find William on the 1901 census, but at 70 years of age he seems to have fallen on hard times, as he is described as a general labourer and is living in Baseford Union Workhouse. Sadly, we say goodbye to William in 1907, and his death certificate tells us that he died in Notts County Lunatic Asylum at the age of 76. He is also described as a boilermaker of Baseford, a return to his lifetime trade. Although he died in a lunatic asylum, it doesn't mean that he was mad. Asylums were generally the only places that could accommodate old people suffering from any form of dementia, unlike today. Did William keep in touch with his family after he left them in Derby in the 1870s? I think he did, as they seem to know when he died, and this picture taken of him in later life in Nottingham has remained in the family ever since. I hope that telling William's story has shown you what can be achieved with a little patient research. When you get used to researching the records that I've described, it's easy enough to move on to other types of records available to the family historian. Things like wills. If you're lucky enough to find one of those, it can tell you a lot about your family. Other records are things like cemetery registers, rates books, trade directories and local newspapers. But don't be fooled by the television programmes that deal with family history. It's not as easy as they make it seem. But with a little patience and care, it's surprising what you can achieve. Good luck with your research.